Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Yabo, and I'm the host of this webinar series, Now and Next, How the Church is Changing for Good. And I'm so grateful that you have joined us today. Over the past month, we've spent time together having conversations as we as church leaders have tried to navigate this season that was so different for us, so challenging for us in the midst of this pandemic of COVID-19, bringing us together to talk through the ways in which we might still continue to do good and robust and vibrant ministries together. You can go back and watch any of the episodes in this webinar series if you just go to amplifymedia.com/now and next. Also, you can find the notes for today's conversation. We also hope that you will stay to the end of this episode to hear a very special message from our sponsor, Amplify Media, about some wonderful resources that they would like for you to get to know about in regards to online worship tools and also small group studies for your church communities. Now, today's episode, we're going to discuss the concerns that church leaders have now as we are phasing back into, in some of our places where we live, into in-person gatherings, and how our church leaders are making those decisions to go back to a way of being together, quite literally physically. Most of us can't wait to be in the same room with our loved ones, for those of us who have been living shelter in place. And for our church families, the same is true. But how do we do so responsibly so that our being together can continue, like our shelter in place, to be a means of hospitality, a means of love, and also a means of justice? And so we have some very familiar faces with us who are going to help us consider what this life might look like when we have a homecoming of sorts. And so I want to introduce you to our panelists who will be familiar faces if you have watched any of our other episodes. So today we have with us Sophia Agtarap.
Hello, friends. My name is Sophia Agtarap, and I'm a deaconess in the United Methodist Church. And for those who are not familiar with the Deaconess and Home Missioner Order, it's a lay order of persons called to a lifetime ministry of love, justice, and service. And that looks like many different things in different settings. And it's really great to be with you all. I work full-time at Vanderbilt Divinity School as their communications director. And so We've explored some of these questions and considerations in different ways in a higher education setting, but I also attend McKendree United Methodist Church, situated in downtown Nashville.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. We also are so glad to have with us Justin Coleman.
Hi again, Justin Coleman. I am a senior pastor at University United Methodist Church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
We won't hold that against you, the Chapel Hill part, as a Duke grad.
Thank you.
We also have with us today Tom Berlin.
Hi, I'm Tom Berlin. I'm the lead pastor at Flourish United Methodist Church in Herndon, Virginia. We're located in the Metro DC area, of just a couple minutes from Dulles Airport, and glad to be here today.
And then for maybe my colleague with the best name in all of Methodism, DJ Del Rosario.
Hey, everybody. My pronouns are he, him, his, and it's a joy to see you. I get to serve in the Pacific Northwest, somewhere between Seattle and Tacoma, and I get to be the pastor at Federal Way United Methodist Church. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah. Well, as I shared earlier in this episode, that we're going to be talking about what our homecomings might look like in our respective church communities. So I just want to start by asking this question of the panelists. Have you and your staff made any decisions about when to return to in-person worship? And if you have had those conversations, what processes or changes are you considering to make that a safe event for individuals?
I'll offer what we've talked about. We are a part of the Tennessee Annual Conference, and so our bishop has not offered any sort of hard and fast date, but what he has reminded us is whenever it is that we go back to in-person in the building together worship, that we are still going to continue offering some form of our service online for those that either don't feel comfortable, safe, or have enjoyed joining us in worship in that particular way. For the university, there are a few more considerations because we are embedded in a larger university that has other considerations. The mayor has issued a 4-phase plan. And so we're working through that. And as a university right now, the only folks that are required to be back on campus are those who have research activities that are not able to be conducted remotely or virtually. And for staff, as far as we know, summer is going to be completely online, and we're actually not required to report for the indefinite future until we hear otherwise.
Tom, you're leaning in.
Go ahead, Tom.
No, Justin took his mic off. Go ahead, Justin. I want to hear what you got to say.
Well, we, in the North Carolina Annual Conference, our bishop has given us guidance in accordance with the phases of reopening that the governor here has put forward. What we realize is that churches in our annual conference, all different sizes, all different locations, have really had a variety of different practices. Some folks never actually ceased in-person worship. And then some of us suspended in-person worship fairly early on. And so our practices as a conference are informed by that breadth. Here locally in Chapel Hill, a set of clergy, ecumenical and interfaith, have gathered every single Monday to talk about the changing dynamic of COVID-19. And so we've taken from our different judicatories all of the different guidelines, recommendations, rules that our leaders have put together, and then created a local set of guidelines for us. We do not intend to enter into gather in-person worship for probably the remainder of this calendar year. And so we'll continue our online options at least through that time period. And then after that time period, as we gather in smaller groups, we'll continue online options until there is a vaccine, until there's enough medical treatments to care for particularly those who are immunocompromised and those who are 60 plus.
Justin, we have some very similar things in the Virginia conference. Our bishop has, although this is a little different, our bishop shut down on in-person worship very rapidly in concern for safety. And now our conference has developed a over 50-page manual on how to reopen, how to do that. The focus, however, I think in these conversations tends to be on in-person worship, and at Flores we've shifted that name. We're talking about in-person ministry, and the reason is I think in-person worship is the deep dive. I think it's the hardest thing you can try to do, and it's also in my opinion, it's the least wise thing that you would try to do right now. In-person worship is by definition what is now being called a super spreader event. Some articles say that that's about 80% of the people who have gotten COVID-19, that's how they've gotten it, is to go to a big event that's held in one location. That sounds a lot like in-person worship to me. And so we're trying to just start with the small pieces. We're trying to figure out, is there a better way to do pastoral care? Why don't we start sitting on the back patio with a closed glass door and talk on a phone while we can see the person, and it's got a little bit more three-dimensional to it than Zoom, as great as Zoom has been. Can we get AA back in our building? That's one of my things. I would like to see AA return in a safe manner. Well, that's, in our context, that can be limited to 12 people. We've got a large room that we could do that in, and I think we could do it safely. We've got people who are making masks. We can give those. So I think when you change the phrase from in-person worship to in-person ministry, all of a sudden you open up a field of possibility that many of us weren't considering, because our time was going into, how will I get 200 people into the sanctuary safely, which for us is not even something we're considering right now. And we won't be considering that for a long time. I think churches are really wise to understand that you're writing a story right now. And it's a story of trust. And if you open quickly, even if you have, I read this morning a church in, I believe in Georgia, that tried to do everything they could to open safely. And then they had a rash of COVID outbreaks associated with that worship service. Well, people will not remember that they chose to walk in your door. They will only remember that you chose to open your door. You will be held responsible, and that's what will be discussed years from now. And God forbid somebody would die. It's bad enough just getting COVID, but we're really talking about a life or death thing for many people, and especially vulnerable people. So there are just a lot of reasons to go slow.
I would say before we even get close to talking about in-person worship, the way that we're prepping that at our church is we're trying to share the responsibility. Although as the lead pastor, I get to help start that conversation of when we think we're ready and how we do it. It's a shared responsibility throughout our church council in addition to our staff. And we're trying to look at it by thinking about the holistic self of a person. How are we caring for their emotional, their mental well-being, in addition to trying to get them to gathering together? And honestly, we haven't done a great job these last couple of months of doing that. So what I've been doing these last couple of months is I've been trying to look at for-profit, nonprofit businesses and how they're engaging the mental well-being of their companies and their employees and how they're doing that, and trying to adapt those ways of serving our people theologically. I feel like we know how to wrap that and serve the platter of how good Jesus is. Mentally, emotionally, psychology today, all those pieces are not pieces that I naturally tend to. So to prepare for in-person worship or that gathering of physical presence, we're trying to also send weekly, if not daily, messages talking about how do you care for your whole self? What does it mean? There's got to be a better term than this, but people use PTSD when we get back, and I think that's a completely inappropriate term. Whatever that term is for this new normal, how do we address that and name that as a part of who we are as followers of Jesus? And the other thing that we're really challenged with right now is when we think about going to in-person worship, we at our church are almost always thinking about the people we see and know. But we're not thinking about being evangelists of people who may have connected with our church or are looking for a church now. I'm thinking about post 9/11 when people started to flock to churches. And we haven't set ourselves up well for that, but we're asking the question, and that's shifting how we begin to engage it.
Yeah. DJ, your last comment actually kind of bleeds into this next question around the fact that, we were thrust into having to, for many church communities, using digital and online platforms in order to provide kind of our Sunday worship moment, although we provide lots of other online experiences to create community. Even as we may consider in-person ministries, in-person gatherings, in-person worship, what are the ways in which you're going to maybe hybridize both the digital world and then also to whatever incarnational ways we might get together? What have you realized you're going to have to hold on to? Oh, you wait with hope, my friends.
I'll take a stab at it, Lisa. We are finding that many of the things that we have done to create community have actually been very well received, and we anticipate that most of them will continue. And so the ways in which in our various ministry areas, staff members create some kind of media in order to connect via social media, we're finding that our folks are enjoying it, are interacting with us more, actually have a better sense of who these staff members are, and are taking more time out of their lives to connect in meaningful ways across the week. And we don't anticipate that going away. This is all while many members of our community are working either from home or in office places, who are homeschooling, all these different kinds of things. A very full life, but also finding great meaning in these connections. And so I think that what we're doing via social media will continue. Also think that in some cases, some of what we're doing in pastoral care will continue to take place online. Very easy to gather quickly for a moment of connection. Will not replace in-person ministry, but certainly is a viable alternative. And I think for so many of our particularly working professionals, the ways that we are doing meetings, usually in a more efficient manner, are so desirable right now. Folks are saying, look, I'm saving time. I don't have to drive up there. I don't have to find a parking place. I can have dinner with my family,
I can wear elastic for the whole meeting,
and then switch into a meeting and then get back to my life. So small groups, Bible studies, church meetings, I think we're going to continue to do a lot of what we're doing, as well as offering wonderful online worship and other kinds of opportunities.
I'll just agree to what Justin was saying, and then add that whatever we will continue to do once we get back to a point where we're meeting in the building together, I think we have to also keep in mind that we have to build capacity and bandwidth for, because right now we're doing this because for the most part, folks are working from home and worshiping and tuning in from home. And some of our work has shifted from what we would typically do in person in an office or in a church building. But when we do start meeting in person, I think we're going to continue many of the things that have worked and that we've been able to connect with folks in different ways. But what that looks like when we're also having to meet in person, I think a serious conversation with folks, because as we've noticed, it takes time. And even though we were sort of forced into this particular way of meeting, I think there are perhaps better, healthier, more sustainable ways to do it. And so to ask ourselves what that looks like and who is going to do it, I think is an important part, even before we start asking our committees how much money we can spend on technology.
I would say, excuse me, Tom. You're so nice, Tom. I would say, right? It's like you should be a pastor, my friend. I would say two quick things. One, when we switched to serving online communion, which was tearing me apart theologically and everything I knew, all of a sudden, we as a community started talking about what's okay and what's not okay. What can we engage with and not engage with? What's holy and sacred and what's not? And how do we engage in ways that not everyone can? I would say that's one. So all of a sudden, the digital age has shifted our theological understanding. And then two, we're doing something this summer that I've never tried before. We're doing a summer mixtape series where we're actually having 4 or 5 other clergy from other parts of our connection preaching at each other's churches. Now, I'm still leading my church in every single way, but we're having guest preachers, which means I'm not the main preacher at my church, which is really hard. But we're learning that doing things like that and scripture reading in new ways, integrating that into in-person worship could be a real gift for us, because all of a sudden we have folks who become more digitally understanding than ever before. So let's lean into that a bit more. That's the two things we're so far learning.
I think one of the great things about this season is that it's a time of creativity. And, often churches are guilty of having idea swatters that every time somebody raises an idea, it just gets hammered down. But I'll tell you, when we had to shift to all online, it was almost like every idea felt like a good idea. And in truth, at about a 95% level, they were. And it allowed people just to express the best they have. I think spreading it out is really important, not feeling like you're the only person responsible. And I think especially people that are solo pastors in smaller congregations shouldn't feel like they've got to create the level of content that a larger multi-staff church is able to create simply because it's got staff members that needs to be fully employed. So a couple of things that we've shifted to that have really been great. We do a daily devotional called The Daily Lift. It's a scripture reading and a short reflection, and it's about 6 minutes long. It's the third most highest used thing that we do right now after online worship and the pastor's weekly e-note. Daily Lift is it, and people, we didn't know that. We didn't know if they wanted that resource, but they love it. Our music folks have done concerts. 2 people, have come in and done concerts for our congregation, and they're very well received and watched. We've done family bingo. The children's director and I, the other night, did family bingo, and it was like the simplest, hokiest thing you've ever been a part of. And 80 families signed on, and we got all sorts of email back saying that was so much fun. Now, I get it that it may not be fun once we're not in the pandemic anymore the same way it was the other night. But right now, if you demonstrate, and listen, anybody could have done that family bingo. It doesn't matter what size church you're at. It doesn't matter anything. We have people all ages. It's not very theological, but hold, you know what happened? At the end of it, there was a family whose grandfather who doesn't go to our church was having surgery in Pittsburgh. His son is with his mother in Pittsburgh. His family is also on bingo and they're home, and everybody else is there. And at the end of it, we all prayed for them. And we turned this sort of a fun fellowship thing. And at the end, we really prayed for that person. We focused our attention there. And I think it gave people a sense of church again. We've got an associate pastor who's doing Ignatian prayer on Wednesday nights. We would have never done that, had we done this. The other thing I would say is look for what other organizations are doing that you can plug into. So there's a organization in our area that focuses on prayer and meditation. So about 12 of us took a class on meditation, Christian meditation, and I jumped in because I thought, that's an opportunity for me to learn something, but I didn't lead it. And this is if you're serving your own church, why not identify a resource and then you as the pastor take it with people in your congregation and be a co-learner. The last thing that I'll mention now is we shifted from doing programs for kids to equipping parents to disciple their children. And I've been so grateful for our children's ministry folks. And again, if you're on your own, you're like, I don't have the children's ministry director, it's okay because other churches do, and they'll give you anything for free right now. Like nobody's going to charge you. You could take that, you could just be added to the list. And especially if you're in a United Methodist context, I speak very broadly for United Methodist churches. We like to share things. And so now may be the time to see a real connection that could be really powerful. Finally, we surveyed our folks on a lot of things like, would you return to worship if you had the opportunity? 95% said no right now. But they also told us which of these things are valuable to them. And now we know what to continue and improve. And we've also seen a couple things that we're offering that we can probably just let those go and start over.
That's good.
And Lisa, can I just share a couple more reflections before we move on? So I think there are two main questions that that I'm thinking about as we move from phase to phase. And one of them is around stewardship. So how can we continue to be good stewards in this? I think what I love here is that we've got less of a carbon footprint. We are not using nearly as much paper products and things like that have to be recycled. And so I think that this has created a kind of a stewardship, at least in some areas, that's positive, and as well as a stewardship of time that many of us have alluded to in various kinds of efficiencies. And then I think on our staff, as has also been alluded to, we're asking questions around what's the reasonable level of time. And so if we can set an appropriate level of that right now, and then it gives us the ability to sustain some of this work after this period is over. And then the final thing I'd say is, yes, Tom is a great pastor. I'd even say he'd be an amazing bishop, but that's just me.
Can I add one more thing?
Sophia.
Us and DJ were both talking, to this idea that this is an opportunity to be creative. Not that we weren't before, but it really has allowed us a space to say yes to things that we wouldn't have otherwise. To perhaps make the point in the case that whatever folks have thought was the exception or something that could never be considered has now become sort of normalized, and that's not something that has to stop when things change in terms of how we gather. Important to keep in mind. The other is, Tom, you reminded me that it's really important to have a feedback loop as we're going forward, because we get so caught up in what we're trying to produce week after week or prepare week after week that we forget to take time to pause and just assess like what worked about that, what didn't, what makes sense to take with us going forward. Because I think I stopped counting after week 7 how many weeks we were in, but it's months. And so to not wait until whatever month it is, month 3, 4, 5, 6, to look back and say what worked and what didn't. But we're constantly doing that, and checking in with folks and getting a pulse as we're going.
Lisa, or sorry, Sophia, have you found a good way to solicit ideas from your congregation about what else, like the things we haven't thought of? Have you all, because we haven't done that yet, and I'm really curious.
No, we haven't explicitly in that way. I mean, it was several weeks into it before we decided we should probably have like a digital connection card where it's a simple Google form to say, who is here? Are you interested in being connected beyond this particular, thing that you attended? And some of it, I think, is folks don't know what they don't know until we offer something. It's like, that was really great. Trivia was really fun. Bingo night is really fun. Sort of talent show or open mic night is really fun. But I don't think it would hurt to just ask an open-ended question about what are other ways you'd like to connect, or what are some activities that you think would be fun to do together. And I think folks would speak up because they've already seen that I think we're more creative now than we possibly have been in the past, and open to suggestions that maybe they wouldn't have even bothered bringing to the attention of church or organizational leadership.
This is going to be kind of like a blitz round, but as you are sitting with your church staff, or maybe not sitting together in the same room with your church staff, but trying to discern what next steps might look like, have there been resources, things that you've read, people that you are leaning into their wisdom that kind of helped you to live in this in-between place? I know for me, I've been getting a lot of my instincts actually from asking myself the question, what things brought me joy back in the 90s? Because we're like calling people on the phone. It's been really interesting. Like I've kind of harkened back to the days of nostalgia, and it's actually helped me to guide me. So are there, a quick resource of people you're reading who might be helping you make some of these decisions?
Psychology Today is definitely one I read quite a bit. The best resource I've found so far consistently is talking to friends and community members and church members about their work-life experience. Because one of the biggest learnings that I would never have thought of is how leaders are often callous to what's happening to those who work under them. For example, the great CEO who's saying, I'm sitting on my back deck thinking about you, as they look over their waterfront view, and people are just trying to make sure they have enough food for their kids. Those kind of things are great reminders for me as a plumb line to root myself into that. And honestly, that is one of the greatest tools, is engaging with church folks, saying, tell me about your work experience right now. What things would you want to shift? Because that helps me understand how to best care for them, not just spiritually, but engage with them in that way. I know you want it to be a blitz round, so beep.
No, that's okay.
Best article I've written on this whole question of reopening in-person ministry was written by Alex Shanks, who's down the Florida conference. It's called Why Reopening a Church is Different. It'll soon be out in the Lewis Center's Leading Ideas, but I think if you go to the Florida Annual Conference website, you can find it there as well. Why Reopening a Church is Different. Alex Shanks is the author. I thought it was just the best thing I've read.
For me, I'm just stockpiling resources. I'm trying to not overload myself with all the webinars and all the things, but I'm keeping sort of a running list in Google Docs of things that I've come across that have been interesting, or that I will read when I have time to read later. But I think one of the groups that gets overlooked are like grassroots community organizers, because they have learned how to be bootstrappy. That's the nature of it, right? And so I think those who organize in your areas, I think, are great groups to look to, because they are the ones that, once this started happening, bam, mutual aid was the first thing that they turned to. And so I think the churches can learn a lot from the ways that they have mobilized and organized, even in the midst of what we have seen as sort of like, we felt a little bit immobilized, but I think other groups that have found workarounds and have always had sort of hurdles to cross have been able to find ways to do this well. And I think that's one of, when we think about how do we continue to connect and care for one another amidst this time of physical distancing, I think mutual aid is a great place to look, and the ways that that's set up from city to city and community to community.
Yeah, I've just been gifted with conversations with every week with a number of clergy from all around the country, a number of psychology professionals, psychologists, therapists. The mental health community has been a tremendous resource to me during these times, as well as members of the medical community.
Mm-hmm. I want to maybe shift our conversation to kind of the people-oriented aspect. And this is, how do we re-engage members and volunteers who might have been kind of socially isolated or even depressed as we talk about maybe re-entry and maybe even specifically those within our communities where it'll still be a risk for them to be involved in in-person gatherings. How do we re-engage those folks?
The way we're approaching it at our church and our community is we don't start that conversation. We ask the question, and then we sit and try to shut up and listen. Mm-hmm. So for folks who are socially isolated, who are openly sharing their mental health struggles on Facebook and social media, saying, "Tell me more. Tell me about what this looks like for you," and not having the hubris to say that we have any answers at all. Mm-hmm. But we're trying to sit with them. I think about Job and that story in the Bible, how some of his great friends, the best thing they did was when they shut up, tore their clothes and sat in the ashes with them. And I think one of the mistakes I could make as a pastor is to think I have any knowledge outside of what God's already doing and how God's working in the hearts of those folks. That's how I'm planning on approaching it. I know there are better ways, so I'm ready to take notes.
Tom, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Just really briefly, for us, once we moved to gathering online for worship, we realized that it was a lot of work. And we were like, why don't we use folks that would typically be ushers and greeters, and how do we incorporate them into how we're gathering? And so we then started asking for volunteers, for those who'd be willing to be sort of not hosts, but greeters, right, before worship started, and continuing to check in with folks throughout the service. So that was one way. The other is making sure that we have multiple voices in the service. And so that just means like recording from your phone or your laptop, or us setting up a Zoom call so that we can record you reading a piece of scripture or doing a greeting. That's one thing that we're doing. And then, you talked about harkening back to the 90s, the best era of music also. But it's phone trees. Like, it's been really neat. As much as I like screen my calls all the time, it's been neat to receive a voicemail from someone, either from an organization that I am a part of or from someone at church who I wouldn't typically connect with, just to check in and say, just wanted to see how you're doing. So I think those ways, writing letters to one another, making sure that we are connected and have the most recent addresses for folks in nursing homes and places where we really can't get to, I think is really important. And I have a colleague who was recently hospitalized, and there was a sort of drive-by, walk-by, bike-by party that was scheduled. And so it was just, he didn't get out of his room, he just opened the window, but folks just, shared greetings and things like that. So, back to this idea that we are called to be creative in different ways, not that we weren't before, to make sure that we are connecting with folks, especially for those who just don't have access or interest in connecting digitally in the ways that we have made the default, I think is really important.
Yeah, these are great lists, and I'm actually making notes for not for what I'm going to say, but for what I'm going to remember, because there's a lot of good here. I think the issue that clergy and lay leaders should think about right now is, how do you routinize some of this? So, it's very tempting to say, well, in that first month, we call all of our active members, and that's great. But now you're in your second month and you're heading into your third. So the question is, over the next 6 to 18 months, and I think that's a really important number, is 18 months, because that is the soonest the general population will be vaccinated in most medical articles that I'm reading. So if we've got to do this for 18 months, we've got to actually create not just an event, but a system. I think that the phone tree thing has been brilliant for us and other churches that have done it. We first started calling our active members, and as we called our laity, they all said, "Can I call people?" There was almost a hunger to volunteer and to make that connection. So then we kept all those names, and I think we've got 50 people now. We're in a larger congregation, but it's not super big. And we then decided, let's call all of our inactive members. Let's call people that haven't connected to us for like 5 years, because they're still sitting on our books. What was great is some of those people said, "Don't call, I've got another church, I'm great." So great, that helped us sort some of that out. But most said, "Hey, you don't have to call back again, but it's really nice." And so it sort of created a rumor that our church really cared about people, that, that they were receiving that phone call, and somebody remembered that they used to go there at one time, even though they decided to drop out for whatever reason. And so there's been for me, these acts of kindness and reconciliation that are involved in that. They're helpful. But now what we've got to do is figure out, how do we keep doing that over time, and what's our routine? I think the routine is incredibly important, and system work, no matter what size church you're in. I myself have a little book, and every time I call somebody in our church, I write it down and I tag a date. I just do it for me. I do it for me because I want to look at the end of the week, because I sometimes tell myself a story that I'm more active than I am in care and in love. So I like to have that little discipline. And I think that's, cards. Oh my goodness, cards. We had a guy who's been in hospice, and the only thing any of us could do is send a card. Even a phone call didn't make much sense at this point. And but he had times where he was very connected and aware, and his daughter-in-law put the cards on a big bureau, and all the cards were listed up there. And then she took a picture of that and put it on her Facebook page, and it was all these cards people in the church had sent. And I don't know how it is for members of my congregation, but for me, I just thought, we're still out there. We're still a church. So I think any sign you give people that you're still a church right now, and that you're deployed, and nothing evaporated, we're all still here, is a good message and a spiritual connection.
Well, I'm appreciative of everything everyone has said, including the 90s, though some of y'all had a holier 90s than others of us. We're doing many of the same things. I think the calling ministries, as Sophia and Tom have talked about, exactly on point, the developing of structures that can be maintained. I simply want to celebrate here the work of particularly our senior adult community, at least in our local church. So there's this myth that gets told in certain churches, or it's at least felt in places, that you begin to age out of ministry once you begin to age. And that ministries of the church are so geared toward particularly younger families, even, right? And so if you're older, or if you're younger and single, you just kind of feel left out. But particularly as you age, and I have seen senior adults stepping up left and right. They're the ones who are creating the systems and staffing those systems and maintaining those systems. And so I think there's another wonderful opportunity here, and a time when people feel like, well, if I can't get there regularly, or if I'm bound to my home, I really can't serve my church. And here is a wonderful opportunity for us to help everyone who fits into that category say, no, I can absolutely serve and lead in the midst of the church life. And so this has provided a wonderful opportunity for that.
Before we take a break, I have one more question, and that is, how are you actually preparing people, whether the ways you're communicating to them about what in-person connection might look like? I think it's one thing to put up signs and to tell people what to do, but we've been habituated to a new way of life in regards to being at home. We're habituated to a new way of being when we're in the grocery store. We're habituated to a new way of being when it comes to standing in line. And now we've got to habituate people to a new way of being when they are in a space called our church buildings. And I just would love to hear maybe how you're communicating, how you are going to help people to be hospitable to one another.
That's a really good question that I think is challenging, Lisa. In the Pacific Northwest, where we are, our governor has set out 4 phases, and we're nowhere near looking at opening and coming back to in person. So right now, the communication we're sharing is, let's prepare ourselves to continue to be Christ in our communities, to walk in faith, to reach out in love. So the language I always use is, we think it'll be easier to re-engage back in person because we know what that looks like, but to stay engaged while we're connecting this way is our heartstring. That's our challenge. The backbone to our church right now is something that we talked about when Justin and I were on the very first of these webinars, which was our class meeting model from the 18th century, where we have community groups that connect with each other, and they're praying with each other, and they're still doing it. And it's really the most important part of our church right now. So what I've found in these last bit of time since we've gone to online worship is I've found ways to be the pastor, to theologically ask questions and to make sure that we're going the same direction, but to step out of leadership in a way that I'm no longer the engine that keeps us going. What keeps us going is our creativity of our lay people and our community groups. So whenever I think of the I, how do I keep them going? It's almost always, wait. Actually, that's not my decision. It's our decision. My role is to be the theological person in residence, to ask questions and to engage in that, and to hearken back to times in Scripture, and to ask other people when they find that as well. So that's been our challenge right now. Is we're nowhere near it. Justin said they're looking at 2021 calendar. We're just saying when we get closer, we'll let you know, but don't hold your breath. But let's hold our breath for our neighbors and for those that we don't see. And let's keep thinking about evangelizing, sharing the good news with those who we don't see in our directories right now. So we continue a 1+1 method, which is engage with one person you know, meet one person in the grocery, your neighbor, leave a note, tell them you're thinking about them, tell them you care about them. If you can buy a gift card, make sure you do that. It's not just random acts of kindness, it's intentional acts of generosity. Prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness. How are you being called to do that right now? And we believe those are the most important ways that we engage back in community, is to remember that church was never meant to be a physical space for us. I've even begun to ask the question, do we even need a church space right now when we can get back into church? And that is very hard for our church to imagine. And at the same time, I think we're in a space where it's okay to ask those hard questions, and they have to be honest. And I really am wondering, if we need that building, what can we do with, if our building's worth $5 million, how can we be good stewards? How can we be great stewards of the resources God has given us?
Lisa, I think your question is really helpful for people to consider, because it's really not about opening a church, it's about creating a new culture. And so, I mean, truthfully, I think every time a pastor moves into a congregation, they have to both learn a culture and discern how they will help create and add on to that culture, or transform that culture in the ways where their calling matches the calling for the congregation at that time. And so I think to do this, the church has always been about creating gracious boundaries. And so we're going to have to create some gracious boundaries about reopening to whatever ministry we reopen. So I mentioned earlier, I'm hoping we can see AA come back into our building. Well, there are going to have to be some boundaries. There's going to be a mask boundary. There's going to be a stand apart. And then we're going to need somebody who's committed to that culture to agree that they will monitor and help improve people. And I think the question that you've got to ask in all this is, if there's a violation of the boundary, then what's the recourse? Because I think that's going to be really hard to figure out as we go, but we'll figure it out because we have to. Second thing, I think we model now for the behavior we want to see later. So during our online worship, which we do in our sanctuary, we tape that in our sanctuary. Sometimes I'll just have folks observe what's in the room that they can't see. And I'll even have the person running the camera swing the camera around. And I'll say, you'll notice that there are 9 people here. And you'll see the distance we're at. You'll notice that we are observing these behaviors. And the same, we have 3 opportunities, groups that are focused on food scarcity. One is a nonprofit in our community that's currently in our building, and then 2 others that our church runs. We're in very separate locations, but again, everybody's got to have the boundaries of how we do that, and they have to agree to them. So, and I talk about that, and we we have claimed science is going to be our guide. We're naming that out loud. We're very concerned. We believe that we are participants in a public health effort right now, and we want to be a part. And so science is the good thing right now. It is not the mean parent figure who never lets you do anything. And so I think that this modeling and naming how we're making our decisions, start that right now, because if you ever get to the place where people are coming back into that building in a larger way, you need the culture to already be in their minds. Mm-hmm. You can't start the day that the door opens for whatever the first, say, 25-person event is. It's got to start with the very first baby steps that you're taking to get into that.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Tom, you, I think, really summed up well what I was going to share, which is communicate well. And that could be by modeling the behavior and the practices that you want folks to engage and adopt. And I think for lack of communication, folks sort of sometimes just fill in the blanks. And given this particular moment we're experiencing, that's not always a healthy thing to do, because there's so much misinformation that's floating around. And so making sure that you have regular communication and correspondence with your communities, whether that's in the form of a quick video check-in, whether it's you showing the behind the scenes of how you're even putting your Sunday morning or whatever gathering together, so you know that we're not just 10 people huddled together sitting around a circle. When we first started social distancing, there were some folks that were posting pictures of like, here's our worship team, and it was like 10 people in a small living room recording, and I was like, that is not the behavior we want to model. So making sure that it's very clear why you're making the decisions that you're making, and that this is going to carry forward even beyond this time of meeting virtually, and explaining why that is. So, when we talk about meeting back in person, if it's limited to 10, 20, 30 people, I think there are other things that we need to have a conversation about around that, in terms of like hospitality. Are you turning people away? Like, what does that even look like? But I think for people to know, it's just as much an act of justice and hospitality and care that you're putting these in place as it is that you want the community to gather. And the more that you can help folks realize also that our meetings virtually and digitally are just as real as in-person things, right? I think the embodied thing is a whole other conversation that folks are trying to wrap their head around. But for a number of folks, this has been a really great way to connect, and they might have been more open and receptive and engaged in ways that they haven't been able to, because they would have had to actually physically go to a church and address maybe other issues that they were dealing with related to even the building or that gathered body. So
this is so good. This is so good. Justin, I don't know if you had anything before we.
Oh, no, I just, just to underscore things that others have said, this is a great time of culture making. For our generation, there will not be a better moment for us to think well about what it means to create culture, because people are moving into this hyper social mode of being. And whenever we resume any in-person activity, any in-person ministry, people are going to be more dialed into one another than they have ever been. So usually you go to a gathering and you see the people that you know and you engage there, but I anticipate people being willing to connect much more. But this will only be for a time period. And so we have a window here in order to do culture making. And I just say, let's use it wisely.
I know this may seem like a very small thing, but I'm being very intentional and careful not to use "when we go back" language, and actually have a reverence for COVID-19 and how it has shaped us. That we're not going back to March 1st. I don't use that language of, oh, remember how worship was on March 8th? We are people who are traversing through the wilderness. We're not going back to, granted, we had a nice service, or it wasn't Egypt, but I think sometimes even using that type of language, like nostalgia can kill the church. If we could just go back. It's like, no, we're going to have something new. I don't even know that I want to call it a new normal. We're just going to have something new. And hoping that because we are people who are shaped by our language, that people will keep their hand to the plow and move in a new direction. This has been so helpful. We're going to actually take a very quick break to hear from our sponsors, Amplify Media. And when we come back, we'll get to hear more about what it looks like whenever we do this life back together in the same space.
Amplify is a space in which Christians can explore their faith more deeply in relationship with one another and be equipped to impact even more people for the gospel. You can even stream your church's services, bringing your congregation together even when they aren't in the same building. Engage your ministry and expand your mission by following these simple steps. Get started with Amplify today.
Friends, welcome back as we continue this conversation of what it might look like, as Tom has so beautifully and eloquently said, in-person ministries look like for us in the life of the church. And I want to maybe start with this question, and that is, for the first time in many people's lives, they are now experiencing collective trauma, where we may be in different boats, but we're all in the same storm to various degrees. What would it look like for the church to both mourn these collective and also to the individual traumas that people have had during this season?
I think one way that we could engage mourning and name it as an unwanted roommate in our lives is to look back at our history. And this is not to minimize what we're going through or our past, but thinking about 9/11, thinking about our economic challenges we had in 2007, 2008, even 100 years ago in the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl era, and those shifts. I think it's critical for us who serve multi-generations to hearken back to the best practices we have seen and engage those moving forward. So even a collective, let's renew our baptism, is helpful, and at the same time naming where the light at the end of the tunnel may be. So what I'm going to be doing and what I've been doing is trying to study a bit of history and how the San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge was built. When the government said we need to give people jobs, we're not just going to give them money. So what we're going to do is give them projects. So how do we engage folks in ways to engage their faith while still mourning in there?
You know, I think it's important just to say things out loud. And I was talking to somebody this morning, who's a member of my church, and a few weeks ago, we had talked about his experience of anxiety, and a couple of things I've started doing is, one is I've stopped talking about the experience of anxiety, and instead I talk about the season of anxiety we're in. So season means, oh, that experience you just had, that's going to come back next week, and it's going to come back. So the question is, when it appears, how do I cope with it? And then I feel a little bit more free to talk about my own experience of things right now as I'm talking to people. I think what you cannot or do not name, you give greater power. And so if this is so uncomfortable that we can't name it, it actually grows in its power over us. And I think that type of generalized anxiety, that type of general experience is something, it's just healthy for us to talk about, well, what are your strategies? What are you, and not like, let me give you my strategies, but what are your strategies? Because I got that too. And here's what I do, but what do you do? And I think for clergy, just sort of getting down on the same playing field with everybody, because the truth is we don't have any seminary that trained us on this. We don't have any background that's like, well, here's what you do in the pandemic. So I think to be in a collective of learners in the church right now is really helpful. And how does our faith guide us? I'm reading the Apostle Paul right now in a whole different way, because I realize he was writing to anxiety-filled, persecuted people. I'm not being persecuted, but I'm in a time that's very different from what my life used to be prior to this pandemic. Second thing, I think there's something about the unique grief of losing someone right now. We just had a staff member in our church lose someone they love very, very dearly, and they couldn't go to the ICU, couldn't be there when a lot of things happened that led to, right before death came. And so I think the more kindness we demonstrate for each other, the best we can do with compassion and love right now. I mean, all the gospel is happening. So I've got this friend, and they were talking about how we're going to do a funeral. They're not even members of our church. But I'm trying to pay attention every time the Holy Spirit's like, this one's for you, pal. Like, you're in, I'm putting you on the field. And so I said to that person, hey, would you like me to help you figure out a Zoom funeral? Would it help to have that conversation? He's like, a Zoom funeral? I never even thought of that. And well, by the end of that conversation, I was going to officiated the service. And what was so moving about that for him was not, ultimately what happened was great, but just the fact that somebody cared enough to say, can I help you with that thinking, was a giant moment. That was a Christ-filled moment for that person. I'm not saying that, I was the savior at all. I'm saying I felt the Holy Spirit's nudge, and I'm encouraging everybody to do that. I think that the listening for the calling and the prompting of the Holy Spirit right now, pay attention to your sense of the Spirit.
I think that I've been formed poorly for lament. So there are no penitential rites to be used outside of, say, a Lenten season or something like that. That is has been a regular part of my tradition. I would say that the way that lament has typically been dealt with is kind of in a power of positive thinking kind of a way. So you get positive, and that helps you move out of this place of lament. And so certain of my colleagues, I think, have such wonderful words to express the pain and the challenge of the time. And because I don't always feel like I have that, I have been, I look for words. And so I've been reading a psalm a day. So that's been part of our church practice when I was thinking, man, maybe I should be saying something every day or regularly during the week. And so 22 days ago, I can tell you, just because I did Psalm 22 this morning, 22 days ago, I just began reading a psalm a day and offering it to the community every morning so that there are words and there are feelings being conveyed from a very raw place that help me to have words. And so that's a way, at least, that I'm hoping to help our community by looking to very ancient words that come from very contemporary places of grief.
My settings are a little bit different, but I think there's a lot of overlap as well. I work at a university, and when we started working from home and sheltering in place, it was the middle of the semester. And so students who were graduating, not just at the university level, but, we've seen across K through 12, have experienced maybe grief for the first time in a different way. You spent, so much money and so much time investing in a degree or a particular course of study, and you don't have a way to celebrate in the way that you had built it up in your head and anticipated. And so we had to ask some of these questions about how do we celebrate in the midst of this. And I think that any loss that we are experiencing in this moment is triggering grief, loss of a job, a family member, a friend being hospitalized. My sister is a nurse practitioner, and she has noted that they're even seeing what could be labeled as like anticipatory grief and anxiety. And so it's not COVID related in that they were necessarily diagnosed with it, but it's anxiety that's brought about by anticipating so many different things, right? And so I think what has been helpful is finding new rituals or reminding ourselves of rituals that might have already existed or that we have practiced but haven't practiced in a long time. And so, Tom, in the same way that you had reminded us to pay attention to the nudgings of the Holy Spirit, I think, this is our opportunity to be facilitators of that exchange, whether it's practicing or learning a new ritual to, hey, I had this idea, are you interested in exploring it? One practice that my sister was talking to me about that she had been engaging in over the last couple months is writing a haiku every day. And it's not because she's necessarily a super poetic person, though she does appreciate, the arts. But it's to help us notice. So just in the same way that you were like turning to the Psalms, if there's a way that we can sum up a day or a learning or something we notice in a haiku or just making it a practice of our daily living, that might also help us to be present and just name the things that we are seeing, experiencing, feeling. And there's a tweet that was circulating, and I think multiple folks have said this, but the tweet said something like, "You are not working from home, you are at home during a crisis trying to work." And so I think the same thing could be said about congregations and faith leaders in the ways that we're approaching ministry is we might have a tendency to overperform and feel like our 8-9 day work day has turned into like 12 without us even realizing it. And so I think it's also important to remind that like we are all experiencing grief and lament in different ways, and maybe the first thing to do is to name it, and then find ways to develop rituals to mark the days and times and moments in our, not just in our day, but in our lives, to help us remember them and celebrate them or grieve them, but at the very least just to mark them so that we're not just going through like zombies, kind of like, I don't know. I mean, yes, sometimes I don't know what day it is. But I think it really is helpful to find what is that ritual that we can practice and mark occasions and hours. Sorry, one more thing I just realized is, as you're thinking is, thinking about grief, and Justin, you reminded me of this and talking about how you were perhaps not taught to grieve or lament well. I only experienced this because I lived in the Philippines for a couple of years, and there's a practice, they practice wakes when someone has died. And, in Tagalog, it's called lamay, and it's a moment where you actually have the body of the person who died in your home as you wait for family members and friends to come and visit. And as much as it is a time of lament and grieving, it's also a time of celebration. Because you're gathered together, you're celebrating the person who died. There's like a band that comes to play. There's like nonstop food. And so I wonder if this is a moment that we're experiencing a wake. Like we are gathered, we're not able to gather in the same ways, but perhaps this is also preparing us for a different time when we can do the things that we had anticipated doing and celebrating, but also grieving, because I think there are certain practices culturally, religiously, that we have sort of had to hold off until whenever that date is, if it will actually happen in the way that we think it will happen. And so I just wonder if this is a time of like a collective wake that we're experiencing in preparation for or something else. And, Reverend Barber talks a lot about a tomb or a womb moment, right? And I think this is that time for us to ask those questions and see what emerges out of those conversations.
I know these thinking about mourning collective trauma and also individual trauma can feel very heavy, but that's maybe in some ways one of the greatest gifts that the church has. I think it's Macrina Whitaker who says this, that joy and sorrow are sisters, they live in the same house. And we are people who hold those realities in every moment, at a service of death and resurrection. Even in our wedding liturgy, we talk about the things that we have to die to in order to live to something new. We are really good at helping people hold that. I think it's that the church can actually be a great model to the world as to how to live with all of these things that we have been kind of thrust into, especially in a culture that calls us to numb ourselves so we don't feel pain, so we don't feel disappointed or frustrated. This is really very, very, very helpful, how we can help people to sit on the mourner's bench. That's the term we used to use in the church community I grew up in, but to also do so with a sense of hope. As we think about when we were having to kind of transition into thinking about like digital platforms, because we are navigating a pandemic, That was a lot of work. And I would imagine for our lay people and also for our staff and for our volunteers, the idea of now having to transition and think about, okay, now how do we re-enter into life where we might have in-person ministries? How might we take care of our staff? How might we take care of the code laborers and the code dreamers who are helping us to make some of these decisions?
I think DJ encouraged us to think about this just a little bit earlier. Just the level of fatigue and strain that is there. Again, Psalm 22 is on my mind. My God, why have you left me all alone? So I can move from that to my God, there's so many people. I'm a bit overwhelmed if I don't give myself a little bit of time. And so I think to help us offer ourselves grace, mm-hmm. and to give ourselves time and help our communities to know that we all probably need time to begin work in an in-person way, in proximity with closer proximity with others, but also to provide extra space, probably for a few weeks, extra space in order to decompress and acclimate or reacclimate to a more in-person environment. For me, I'm already beginning to think about, well, I'm just going to need a little bit of time.
Mm.
Some of the conversations we're having right now have to do with my three little girls who are 11, 10, and 10. They have teachers who, from my perspective, work very hard and are stretching their levels of engagement in ways that I think are similar to the way churches and faith communities are. And for example, yesterday, my daughter was like, oh, I'm going to text my teacher this picture I promised to text him. And we had a great discussion around whether or not it's okay to text a teacher on a Sunday or not. And I think this lends to the conversation, the question you asked, Lisa, because modeling how we engage with those around us and provide Sabbath is critical. I could easily say, make sure I take my time off and people know I do out of office replies. But those practices, I hope, are instilled in who we are. Mm-hmm. But finding ways to provide Sabbath for others, the way I understand the biblical sense of Sabbath means giving the donkey and the horse rest, is critical for us. So some of the ways we practically do that in our family is naming how we engage with our teachers, how we provide gratitude. Our family still has little bags of gifts and essentials that folks who are transitioning or homeless need. And we've included sanitizing wipes and masks as well. So we still drive around in our community and we do it in a way that is physically safe for them and for us, but we still try to give bags to those who are in need because those people are our neighbors and our community, and we're getting to know them by face, if not by name, if we're lucky. I think those little practices lend to much bigger ways of showing how we engage in person and what does that mean for us. The out of office is something that I forgot to do for the first 2 months of this, but now doing that on social media and on my email has begun to teach our people that even though you have time on Friday or Saturday, this is my time to engage with my family, and I need my Sabbath rest because you deserve your Sabbath rest too. I know these are practices that happened long before what's happening now, but I think they're all the more essential to provide Sabbath for others and to engage in Sabbath ourselves.
If I could interject briefly. So, DJ, I love what you said about Sabbath. And part of the question for me is, if I'm supposed to give my donkey and my horse some rest, who are the donkey and the horse? My computer and my phone or my devices, my beasts of burden, never tell me that they're tired. And I think that's part of what helps you to know, well, I've got to take a break because I can't tax this beast of burden more. Well, my beasts of burden are never tired. And so being able to name the donkey and the horse, I think, is important.
You know, I think that I feel like I'm going to sound like Ebenezer Scrooge here, but the primary way that we care for our staff at the church, and I know a lot of churches, a lot of people watching don't necessarily have staff people, but most churches have one or two people. We keep them employed. And we've tried to really talk about that with our congregation, because if you really want to raise somebody's stress level, tell them that they don't have a job. So not only keeping them employed, but helping them be fully employed. Help them be, I don't want somebody to feel like, well, I used to do a job that is less done. Well, we need to redeploy you and get you working. And that's true for your volunteers too. If you've got some key volunteers, make no mistake, the volunteerism they're not doing is put a hole in their life, a hole of meaning and a gap. It may not be a financial gap. So one of the ways that we care for people is we help them find that new thing that may not be available to them, that may not be the same as what they were doing back in February. I think encouragement is really important, and being careful and again, systematizing encouragement. I know that's going to sound really like, wow, that's not authentic. I think the most authentic things we do are the things that we care enough about that we're thoughtful about having a practice around them. And then finally, one of the conversations I'm noticing amongst people is I would encourage us all to not judge the weird thing that you do in COVID that helps you. That's not what I do. So when this thing started, I started filling my neighbor's woodshed with wood. And I've got a associate pastor who said, I don't even want to hear you talk about that. That just wears me out. And I was like, well, don't judge me for what I'm doing. Like, I don't judge you for taking a nap. And I think we just need to give each other space to do the thing. Like, I also set up a hammock, so it's a both and in my world. But when I have something that keeps me busy with my hands, my mind is uniquely at peace. And so that may not be everybody else's thing. I don't need to be anybody's thing, but find your thing. And your thing may be like the way you rest the donkey, may be it takes a nap, but it also may be that there's these other things. Now, if like I drink too much, that's out of bounds. That's not what I'm talking about. But if you've got functional things that you're doing, encourage people to find theirs.
I don't have much more to add other than I think if you wait for someone to express that they're tired or they break, it's too late. And so in this moment where everyone is just giving so much more than they might have been expected to, and probably voluntarily, I think it's really important to name and celebrate what folks are able to give, and to also always offer an out or a time for pause or rest before they work up enough courage to send you that email to say, I'm really tired. Can I take like a 3-week break? And even notes of encouragement are go a long way, I think, because it acknowledges that you've noticed what someone is doing. And I think, DJ, this is in your conference. Didn't the bishop ask that you all took a break X number of days after Easter? Or
I think that was Bishop Haller in Iowa. And and they provided a worship service for people to use anytime in the month of May.
The point is, make sure that you're, before someone asks, just acknowledge that this is a rough time for lots of folks, and to offer that. And I also think that we can extend that to things like grocery deliveries, right? That's one less delivery that an essential worker who picks your groceries from Whole Foods would have to, add to their list of things to do. I think there are ways that we can also give folks a rest in this moment. Or if you do need groceries delivered, like give them an extra large tip. I've been, when it does get delivered correctly to our address and not the neighbors, I have a bag of masks ready to give our delivery person. So I think whatever ways you can acknowledge the work that someone is doing, even if they're not asking for it, that we do that, because I think this is the moment where we have to show and know in certain terms that we are generous people, right? And that means do that wherever you show up. Like, if you're going to go through drive-through, wear your mask because you care about that person and you want to give them a break. And that's one less person they have to interact with who does not care to like protect themselves, you know? So see how that extends not just to your staff who you have any responsibility over, but to anyone that you might encounter that's putting themselves at risk in some way.
If you all will stick with me for two more questions. This is COVID-19 has been in some ways a teacher. And the season that none of us have ever navigated before, I think, Tom, you said this, we did not take a class in seminary on how to navigate a pandemic as pastors. But we've learned, and I think that when we're now thinking about re-entry or in-person ministries, what are some of the things that maybe you want to leave behind that you recognize no longer serve us as we start to kind of reimagine life in the church? And this can be even on a personal level.
We're starting to have conversations at Flores where we're just looking at our entire ministry, and I think what I'm going to describe as a way to do what you're describing rather than what we're going to do. We're starting to look at every ministry and just ask this question: why did we do that? Does it work? Is it cost effective? And do we want to continue it? And it's a very gentle conversation right now. It's not like we're axing the budget. It's not that modality at all. It's very much just sort of a curiosity and so I encourage any church anywhere to do that. I just think you've got an opportunity. You have a once in a lifetime opportunity right now that when we get to vaccination of the general population, your ministry doesn't have to look the same. And friends, for a lot of us, your ministry wasn't that really working all that well. So now's the time. Now is the time to launch into things, and commit to the online piece. The generation that's coming is far more committed to online than I am. So I need to become as committed as they are if I want to reach them for Christ. That's my mantra inside here right now. And I know that some of my oldest members aren't committed to it. That's okay. We're going to keep, reaching out and doing all the things we do. In terms of my personal life, we pre-tape our worship service right now. And for the first time in my adult life, I string a 2-day thing together called a weekend. It has been my first genuine experience of Sabbath. I am for it. It's amazing. Everybody ought to have it. I finally figured out why God commands it, and it's because God loves me. And so that's something I want to maintain. The same way I talked to a church member yesterday who said, I don't really want to ever go back to my office again. And I think, this conversation started about how do we re-enter, I think what we ought to pay attention closely to is that there are some things that we don't want to re-enter.
Right.
And we're all so desperate, especially people that are less comfortable with an online work, are sometimes dying to get back in to quote regular church, because that's what we're trained for. That's what we know we can do. And what if this is a time where God's telling you, no, I want you to embrace the discomfort of the things that you're having to learn so that you're going to be prepared for the ministry I want you to be in. That maybe that's the thing. So, but in terms of my personal life, I just, I'm starting some hobbies and some things, some skills that on a personal level, I'm really excited about.
He's chopping wood for people, for crying out loud, going full on Paul Bunyan for neighbors. I think that everything that Tom said, I just say amen to. And what I'm thinking about letting go of is idols, and so much of the idolatry of the church, I'm sorry to say, is in our spaces, and how tied we are to them. And so I'm incredibly moved. And so we're tied to our spaces, and we're tied to people being in them, by golly. And so I'm incredibly moved by these companies that are saying, look, you don't actually have to come back to work in this physical space. It's helped us to rethink. And so I love so many of the spaces that I inhabit, but I also realize that they were in some cases, more of an idol than I thought they were in my life. So that is what I'm trying to leave behind. And then it's a dovetail between what I'm leaving behind and what I'm embracing, a different kind of leaving behind. I am the rigidly bifurcated work family dynamic that I have accepted is now that I've eased into this new way of being, I appreciate the ability to be a bit more fluid. And one of the things that I realize is my kids, for the most part, never really, apart from Sunday morning, never really get to see me as a disciple of Christ during. They get to see me when everybody would expect it, missional activities, local church activities. But how am I a disciple of Christ when I'm doing homeschool? How am I reflecting Christ when I'm doing homeschool? Which is not always, it's poorly sometimes, but it's really challenged me to think about embracing family in a different way and embracing my Christian witness throughout the day in different ways. It's prompted that. And so I've been trying to allow this time to make me be a better Christian throughout and enjoy my kids being able to see me work, which is a tremendous gift that we actually haven't seen for the most part since the Industrial Revolution, right? An incredible way of doing discipleship with those around me.
Yeah, DJ or Sophia, any? Yeah. Battle of the mic.
That's right. I will always lose and yield to you, Sophia. One thing I would say is at the beginning of this in March, I was in the middle of my next round of infusions for an illness I have. So I was going to the hospital and taking chemo. I think I had 3 or 4 more sessions left in the middle of all this. And I don't name that like, oh, woe is me. Actually, I named that as something I want to leave behind was my false identity of believing that church needed to happen because I was the one keeping the engine running. Because when all this happened, I literally had to let go of things that I physically and emotionally, mentally wasn't able to do. And our church leadership stepped up. And at first, I just wanted to grab it back when I started to feel better. But now I'm kind of loving calling our church lay leaders my colleagues. I often call clergy friends colleagues, but they're my fellow disciples, and they have something to say. So one thing I want to let go of is something that no one taught me, but I picked up on my own accord, which is the belief that I have some esoteric knowledge or connection with God. The humble brag is we always say it, but I actually think my practice reflected it. That I actually believe that if a good idea didn't come from me or I didn't put my stamp on it, it couldn't have been good. It can't be a way of disciple making. But actually, honestly engaging with our lay people and saying, tell me how you want to engage, and then trying not to judge a comment or a statement, but to say yes, which is my second thing I want to shift, is to try to find ways to say yes and not to live my life in finding ways of saying no. As my partner and spouse reminds me, when I find ways to say yes, I'm forced to let go of the things that are no longer essential. My yes forces me to let go of the things I should have said yes to in the first place. And it forces me to be have my life be engaged with God. So I've really enjoyed saying yes to as many times as I can to God and literally to moments of engagement. And it's been so hard and so humbling. I feel less prepared and less confident in my ability to be a pastor and more reliant on God's daily bread than I did at the beginning of March. And I don't ever want to go back to that again. I don't ever want to be that person that thought I had anything. And yet my confidence is in Christ. And that's pretty freaking cool. So I'm a both end. So I'm just going to laugh at myself and be grateful that God's ministry is really cool and it happens around me and I get to witness it. and on my best days, name it.
I'll just add one more thing, and that is, I think oftentimes our identities are formed by the work or the ministry that we do. And so when some of those pieces are taken away, the physical pieces like the building, the office, the in-person things, the preaching and the ways that we've been used to, what do we do with that? And I also say this as a layperson, but as someone who has many clergy in her family, and friends who I'm just kind of observing the grief around that too, right? And the conversations that we've had around discipleship and how that can look differently. And we've tried to have those conversations for years. And now we are given an opportunity where we have to ask the questions and we have to at least try to wrestle with what that looks like. And so I am hopeful that as we move into whatever the next thing will be, that we've taken pause to really ask the questions and have some serious conversations around it. And, thinking of like communication stuff, not that we have to have like a white paper that's documented all the learnings, but I think it would be useful to really like take this moment seriously and say, ask the questions that you're asking Tom earlier is, when you think back to, if we take it back to the making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, right? Can everything that we do point back to that? If not, then like, why are we doing it, right? So in the ways that we meet, like actual like administrative meetings, does that need to happen in the same way? Probably not. What can we do, less of and more of? I think are important questions that really will guide what the next thing for the church will be. And if we take that invitation seriously to ask the questions, I think we will be a different church, which I'm hopeful for.
Tom, did you have, I didn't know if that was a hand to offer a profound word.
No, I was just, I think that was great to hear. I don't have anything to add though. Thank you.
Yeah. This is my last question, and it may sound like as I'm asking you, what do you want to leave behind, this idea of next. And I think we all can conceptualize one day some in-person ministry. When you conceive what that first thing is, and right now, all of us who are having this conversation, we've not had our first yet. What do you conceive to be your first in-person ministry looking like? What is it? A picnic? Is it a sitting on the lawn somewhere? What are you now kind of dreaming up as the first?
I think for me, it's going to have to be something around food. So at church, whether we have like a rooftop area that we can get to from the church parking garage. And so it could just be like a picnic together. At Vanderbilt, we love food. Every single gathering we've got food to enjoy together. I think that was one of the things that folks grieved when we didn't get to have our graduation celebration, is like the spread that we would enjoy together and the dancing. So I think it will be a party of sorts. Mm.
Our bishop is currently not allowing in online communion. And so I think a lot of my thoughts right now are, as we are getting the ability to have smaller groups meet in person, I think that's going to be, figuring that out will be central to what we do.
I'm going to give a second round to probably eating. We do a picnic, a church-wide picnic once a year. It's one of those things that we're missing out on. And so something like that, we can gather together on the front lawn, get some good music, eat and celebrate together. As a part of that, I will say that we are not currently celebrating online communion as well. And so I would just extend that to just table practice. I'm looking forward to table practice.
Love the idea of food, so I'm going to third or fourth that. I would also say I have a dream that our church will have doors that are wide open physically. I have a dream that our church will not look like the people, just the people that I knew before this started. That will be, will look like the kind of people that will actually engage with our neighbors the way that we talk about, but we really will. My dream is that people will invite their friends and neighbors to a place where they feel safe and they're proud of, because they know it's a safe place where we can ask questions, where we can worship together, and that we'll have enough parameters so they don't have to worry about whether or not they're safe. That we'll think things through, we'll communicate well enough, we'll build enough systems of redundancy so that when we're together, we can be fully present and not just worrying about physicalness, emotionalness, and all those pieces. And that we can mourn together and we can celebrate together and that we can honor wherever each person is. And I think that'll be really hard, but only God can do it. And that's kind of the point, right?
Mm-hmm. I want to thank our panelists today for, one, coming back to be with us and to share this wonderful information. We have said over and over again throughout this webinar series that these practitioners who've come together, it's not just simply about scribbling down lots of notes, but that this information, by the grace of God, turns into transformation in our lives as church leaders and those who are wanting to serve the people that God has called us to serve. And so thank you. Thank you for being with us. We also want to just say thank you to all the other panelists who have been with us on all of these episodes. We have learned a tremendous lot. I think the great gift that we can say and celebrate is that when we leverage one another's gifts, we are an unstoppable force. So we're all colleagues together. And so I want to thank all those who have helped to make this series possible. And we want to especially thank Amplify Media for hosting this webinar series, helping us to navigate this pandemic together. Next week, Amplify Media is going to actually do a demonstration of their online worship tools and some of their small group studies. You'll get a link in the email so that you can be a part of that. Many of these tools that may be free to you through June. And so we do hope that you will register to be a part of that online demonstration that Amplify Media is going to host. As we share every single time we gather together, you can find and watch previous episodes on amplifymedia.com/now and next. And we do hope that you will access these resources along with the notes from this conversation with our wonderful panelists today. Thank you so much for being with us, panelists. Thank you so much for being with us, those who are watching this episode as we now turn from the now to the next. Have a good one.